After graduating, did 1 year with SETS, which is the Scottish Engineering Training Scheme, and then joined what was then the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board, and that was 1967. And I joined in what was at that time known as the CEME, the Chief Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Department in Perth. This was a department that was responsible for protection and telecoms at that time.
I started as an apprentice electrician with Southern Electricity Board way back in Bournemouth. That would be, about 1957. And I retired at the end of 1999. My history is strange because I started as a craft apprentice, being a failed 11 plus. We came out of London, ended up taking a craft apprenticeship with Southern Electricity Board in Bournemouth. A very kind chap by the name of Mr. H.F. Brewer at the time was the district manager, and he interviewed me and gave me a job as an apprentice electrician. He presented me my certificates at the end of my apprenticeship. He gave me additional training as an engineer for 2 years. He appointed me to Southampton as a general assistant engineer and to Bournemouth as an engineer. And finally, after that I decided that it was time for a move, and I moved all the way up to the Western Isles as a young engineer based in Stornoway, looking after the Western Isles, only 3 of us. I helped put electricity into North Uist, and then after 4 years of that, moved to East District in Aberdeenshire, ran a section of Aberdeenshire as a section engineer, back to the Western Isles as a deputy manager, deputy district engineer there, and then gravitated to the operations maintenance department in Dingwall, which was really a transmission job. So I virtually stayed on that. The thing I always loved was the technical side of electrical engineering.
I joined the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board in 1986. When I joined in 1986, I was sponsored through an honours degree course. After graduating, I worked in distribution. Since 2004, worked in initially networks and then SSEN Transmission in a range of roles, including project management, system planning, customer connections, and now in data management.
I started in 1954 as a craft apprentice in Durham Crescent Road, which is the Dundee area of the Hydro Board. I did that for 3 years. It was mainly technical. I didn't have a technical apprenticeship as such, but basically that's what I was getting, and that was understanding. After 3 years, it was day release. I had my ONC, got it with distinction actually, and they recommended that I went to college, which I did. I was at Queen's College Dundee for 3 years. I then came back to the company at Carolina Port as assistant shift charge engineer. I did about 2 years of that, and then I was promoted to what I think it was called technical assistant.
I joined the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board in 1979, and I retired in 2014. I joined then because I trained in the northwest of England with Norweb, the electricity company, and I'd spent then a couple of years with some consulting engineers down in the south of England. And I really fancied the idea of coming to Scotland and working in a place where there is distribution and transmission, but there's also a lot of outdoor activities. When I joined, I was pretty much fresh out of training really, and I was part of the district engineering team, mainly working on distribution. But of course there was a grid supply coming in on the transmission system, the twin tower line that comes down from the Inverness area down the Great Glen.
I started working for North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board back in September 1986, and I left SSE in July 2019. My initial position when I joined, I was a graduate trainee. As far as transmission is concerned, I came for a 2-week stint in early December 1986 where I worked at Portnacaig, which was the control room near Pitlochry. And then I joined transmission back in late 2012 and worked in transmission for just over 6.5 years.
I've got a very easy start date to remember. I started on 8/8/88, so 8th of August 1988. So I've been with the company for 37 years. After having started as a sponsored student, my first full-time position was in Dingwall as a third engineer. The kind of work I carried out there was largely on the distribution network at the time. I worked in Oban for about 3 and a bit years, looking after the network in around Oban, all the islands off the west coast, etc. I then moved to Peterhead Power Station for just under a year, then moved to Aberdeen and worked in the distribution in Aberdeen for about 3.5 years, finally ending up in transmission back in 2012.
I first joined the company in 1982. I was hired as a craft apprentice, electrical and instrument at Lerwick Power Station. The duties were anything from looking after any of the electrical systems on the old diesels that were there at the time. I quite enjoyed generation. Once I was a fitter, I was allowed to go back to college, and once I'd done that, I had a job as a shift operations engineer, which meant that you were in charge of the station on a shift rota 24/7. I then moved to distribution within Shetland, which was quite exciting. We looked after Lerwick, Scalloway and the south part of the mainland, so there's a lot of new factories, new supplies going in, but also refurbishment going on. Got involved in all aspects of distribution engineering. And then in '95 I moved to grid control in Pitlochry. That was quite it's quite interesting, because I was always interested in systems being interconnected, and in Shetland, when the diesels were operating, I was fascinated with the flows between each one as you adjust the voltage and the fuel there. I remember being fascinated that we couldn't just push lots of power through the line. There came a point when the voltage collapsed, and I'm thinking that's fascinating, because I've not come across this before. And that's the type of thing that really sparked an interest in working in grid control.
So I have two really memorable projects that I'm very, very proud of. One was the remote control of Foyers. This was at the time one of, if not the largest, power station to be remotely controlled. We didn't consider it to be a challenge by then. We had the system that worked, and all we were doing was building a bigger one. But it was still quite an important thing to get right. And the second one was bringing all the control centres and refurbishing the control centre at Portnacraig.
There was one memorable incident, a huge storm cut power everywhere north of Brora, and we had to mount a big exercise to try and get power on. Of course, nothing could happen until the grid was restored, but there was still broken lines going further north, and that was stopping the grid system from supplying that part of the Highlands. I think it was a joint Elgin and Dingwall squad of guys. They put in atrocious conditions, and imagine working on steel when, if you had bare hands, they would stick to the steel. And I remember really being such an admirer of the pluck of these guys. But when you have 150 or so people gathered in a place like Brora, they were fun in the evenings, I can tell you. I remember the Marine Hotel Brora is quite a famous place in the north, and they would take our staff as a base. It was a large hotel, only if we provided gas. So we sent trucks from Inverness up to Brora full of gas bottles so the men could eat in the evenings.
So I worked on several brand new transmission substation projects where we constructed new transmission substations to enable the connection of renewable generation. One of those projects was Griffin Substation, which enabled the connection of just under 200 megawatts of renewable wind power generation to be connected and to be able to use the transmission system. It was quite a challenging project. It involved bringing together a large team of specialists. It was quite a challenging time scale and also a challenging terrain and environment. When we started the project, we installed a new tower, so whilst the tower foundations were getting installed, there was 6 feet of snow fell over the weekend, so just gave us an idea of the environmental challenges involved in construction.
Industrial disputes that caused power outages and the rota disconnections. And we came up with, at head office, it was actually Bill Tolmie, and he promoted the idea of remote control of the voltages, because that was one of the steps. We went to a 3% reduction and a 6% reduction of the voltage to reduce the demand on the electricity. That was the first steps, and then it became distribution circuits were switched out. We had this remote system from the control rooms called Salome, Substation Alarm and Load Monitoring Equipment. Bill actually came up with that clever name. We had to install that in lots of substations, and so I was given the job of designing standards for the switchgear layout. Not the switchgear itself, but the protection and control of the switchgear. And that led me to be quite involved in the standardisation of protection systems throughout hydroelectric.
So in terms of a memorable project that I've worked on, one of the ones that really sticks in my mind is quite a recent project. It was the HVDC network, the Caithness-Murray and now Caithness-Murray-Shetland connection that we've done. First of all, that was really quite different technology from what we've been used to. Traditionally, we've always connected AC technology in our network. HVDC isn't new technology. It's been around for many years. I think the 1950s were probably the first big expansion of it across in Scandinavia, but since then it's slowly expanded around the world. We connected our first HVDC link between Blackhillock in Murray up to Spittal in Caithness back, I think it's connected back in 2018-19. Now that's the first HVDC link we'd ever connected. Brand new technology, which for us absolutely great. Then latterly we've extended that from Caithness up to Shetland. So it's actually the first multi-terminal HVDC link anywhere in the world of this type of HVDC technology outside of China.
Looking back, I think I'm probably most proud of two things, actually. I'm most proud of the asset management structures that we brought in and developed for many years after they were brought in 1995 or so. It was something that wasn't there in the first place, and I think the developments in asset management have come on tremendously over that period. I'm proud of the work in which my team and I have done in developing the transmission system, in terms of at least recognising the reinforcements that would be required and planning the system to ensure that it is sufficient, it is developed in an economical way, given the challenges of the uncertainty of how much generation was actually going to materialise. And I'm very pleased, looking back over a few years now, as to how that has developed, the achievements that have been made, and proud of the plans that are still to come.
Work culture is an interesting thing. As you're part of it, you probably don't see the changes as well as you might see the changes if you're on the outside looking in. The one thing that I would definitely say is that from day one, the priority with everything we did was safety. There was no sense that I ever had that people were not committed to safety. Safety was number one priority. There was also a real commitment to the Hydro Board. People felt that they were part of the community, and they wanted to do things for the community. And I think the the locals felt that the hydro board was part of their community.
Safety's number one. It's our number one priority. We have a licence that if it's not safe, we don't do it. There's a strong service ethos, and also I think a concern for the environment in terms of sustainability.
It feels like you work within a family. Your work colleagues are your friends. Culture in this company is fantastic. It's very friendly, very supportive, and we look to help people out.
I think maintaining security supply was one of our biggest challenges. Most people wouldn't have appreciated how difficult it was and the amount of work and mitigations that we put in to achieve that.
I think the biggest challenge for transmission in recent years is probably the growth and the speed of that growth, because to train people to work in transmission, it takes time, and we've had to recruit quite aggressively and will continue to do so for a few years. And I think it's made us look a bit wider, to look for different routes into the control centre, which has actually proven really good, because we've got people from other industries, from offshore, from working at sea, Grangemouth. When Langanic closed, we brought people in, and also we've brought folk from different countries that are highly skilled. We've got folk from Zambia, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, to name but a few. And these folk have brought in I guess a diversity in thinking to challenge how we do things. And as we move forward and learn new technologies and have to work at a greater pace, I think these things are valuable.
The biggest challenge of my time in transmission was the ageing of the equipment, particularly the exposed transmission lines. The oldest of them went back to the 1930. Many of them were post-war, but had changes of design, and some of the conductor designs were such that corrosion was beginning to occur. The steel wire which is in the cable to give it tension strength so that we can have long spans in transmission. Some of the protection on the steel wire was insufficient and caused corrosion. So we were finding that we had to detect the problems before they became a fault. One way of doing it was to have a trolley device that we pulled along the transmission lines, which had a clamp on it just over size of the conductor, and if it met a swollen corrosion point, we knew to investigate that. What that wasn't any use for was actually joints that were near the transmission towers when we had to joint there. And it was a blessing when we started using heat-seeking equipment, and helicopters started being used for that. We would be able to go along quite fast with the heat-seeking equipment and spot hot joints or corrosion points where the conductor was heating up more than the normal. That was a big improvement, I would say, when we came to that.
The biggest success was being able to maximise the transmission system at the time with the tools we had. I think that was a great success. And it's an absolute delight for me to think about what's happened now and see the development of renewables and the need for power transfer. That in a different world, I think, to what we were living in at that particular time.
The biggest success for transmission has been building on the successful delivery of projects to date, and therefore getting the support of NISO, Ofgem and the government, that we're able to ramp up delivery and build on that successful project delivery and take that into 2030 and beyond, and be able to deliver on the accelerated strategic transmission investment schemes and the other schemes identified in the holistic network design and the like.
I think the biggest success for the company, in my view, is the fact that within the north of Scotland you can still do a really professional job and be part of a community and really get involved in something that's quite contemporary. We are driving to net zero. We have got good jobs for folk that want to do that, and I think that's a great success, that we're doing that on our doorstep and nobody else is doing it for us.
I think it gets more stick because of it has the most visible impact on tower lines, and to the public they think that it's very unsightly, whereas to an engineer sometimes, I can quote Bill Tolmie, who thought that towers were a thing of beauty, and certainly from an engineer's point of view they're very clever, but I can also understand the fact that they make an impact on the countryside, but the convenience that they bring to our way of living is something I would say is well worth accepting, and we do everything to try to make it less visible by stretching out the longer lines, positioning the towers so that they're not too obvious. The substations themselves make an impact, but again, very often we pick a site which is reasonably screened or secluded, not to impact too much on the public vision.
Well, whether transmission gets its true recognition is up for interpretation, really. Ask a distribution engineer in one of our districts what's most important, and he'll say the 11 kV network and getting people back on. So yes, I mean, there were times certainly when the grid system was failing and we got that back on. It's one cog in the machine, and there are times when on the transmission system we've wrapped up our faults and we've gone into the districts with snowcats and unimogs and four-wheel drive lorries and helped the districts out by pulling up their equipment. I see no distinction between the guy in the street putting a fuse in on a low voltage cable than somebody working on a 400 kV supergrid and doing the same sort of thing.
Within the SSE group, SSEN Transmission is starting to get the recognition that it deserves. I think a lot of times transmission doesn't get the recognition it deserves. I think there's no transition to net zero without transmission. In the past, a lot of the focus has been on renewable generation and the large generation schemes. There is a recognition that we need to expand and upgrade the transmission network to enable that renewable generation to reach consumers.
Do I think transmission gets the recognition it deserves? Probably not, and I think that's our fault. People that work in transmission quite like quietly solving problems on their own. They don't like telling everybody what they're doing, and if something happens, hopefully we've prepared for it and we just quietly get on with it and fix it. And I think for that reason we probably don't get the recognition we deserve, but on the other hand, I'm not sure if we'd really want it.
I really marvel at the Highland Grid as they've been able to build it today. I remember clearly that the cable links into North Scotland from places like Shetland and then Orkney, Western Isles. The Western Isles was always in the back of our mind in my day, but some of these larger connections down into Keith and South, I'm sorry, I've missed out on all that. It was always a good memory.
The Highland Grid today continues to expand. There's a lot of projects going on. There's projects that are happening that we played around with in the very embryonic stage way back in the 2010s. The advice would be measured, continuously talk to your customers, understand the customers' project programs, understand all the risks that customers have to deal with.
We experienced an absolutely horrendous snowstorm. I can't remember the date exactly, but possibly 78, 79, when the weather conditions came up with a very high wind and temperatures of about +2, +3 and a high snowfall. But the snow was falling through this air at plus degrees, so it fell as wet snow. When it hit the lines, it stopped moving, and the windage then, ventilation effect came in, so that, as you know, when it's blowing a wind, you feel much colder. That froze the wet snow into ice, and it built up, and the weight of the ice turned the cable round and exposed a fresh surface, and then that would build up, and the weight turned round. So it built round and gradually built up to large diameter ice on the lines. And that affected both transmission and distribution. But it wasn't until we developed the mapping systems that led us to know better what systems remote control was telling us. That it was an advantage, and the remote readings could tell us what consumers, by looking at the map to see how many people were connected to circuits. So all these things were coming together to give an improved service to the consumer.
Almost the first day when I was on as a control engineer in charge of the transmission system, the north of the system, it was a lightning strike, and the north of the system split away from the south. And actually this was the first time in our experience. What happened was that the protection had, at the contour end, it was dead circuit charging, but at the Bewley end, it had the sync check to make sure that it wasn't out of sync, which it had been. But as we were pulling it down together, the two of these relays said, "Oh," and we closed. You know, the actual problem as to the reason why it tripped was when the double circuit tripped, the power went onto the 132, and it so happened at Keith it went through a bus section switch, and people had adjusted the protection up on all the lines but never thought of the bus section switch, and it was still set low, and it opened on overcurrent or something. So that was almost my baptism of fire. It was quite early on when I was looking after things.
The trick is to have a job that you like. If you don't like the job, you're not going to be very good at it. If I was going to say to a youngster who asked me the same question, I'd say, if this is a job you like, it's fantastic. But I would hate to be in a job which I didn't like. So do what you like. You're going to be doing it for 30 or 40 years. It must be soul destroying doing a job that you don't like doing. I would say if you like doing it, you'll be good at it. And the trick is to try and want to be better.
I don't know if I'm in a position to give people advice, having been out of the company for so long. I would say grasp the opportunities that you get and be willing to face the challenges. Don't shy away from them. I think you have to face challenges.
So if I was to give somebody advice starting in the company today, if you're intrigued in what's going on, find somebody that can explain that to you in the way that you understand, and don't sit quiet.
The people side, I think, was very important to us and stays with me today. Particularly if you go to airports and you get these taps on the shoulder and people say, "Hello, Ian," and you look round and you start saying, was it Shetland or Southampton? Where on earth was it in life? But yes, it was good family.